Hello, friends. Welcome to Vichitra Collective. This is a safe space for filmmakers and other film professionals, women filmmakers, to come together and talk about their films, discuss their experiences in the medium. I am Shabnam Sukhdev. I'm a filmmaker, educator, and an artist. And I call myself an artist because I do things other than films as well. So I've been making films for the past 20 years, I think. And today I'm here to talk about my work, The Last Adieu, with fellow filmmaker Bani Singh. The theme of her film relates with my film as well. Bani's film is called Taangh, but I'll let her talk about it. So over to you, Bani. Great to have you here.
Thanks, Shabnam. And it's so lovely to be at this Vichitra Collective talk and share a space with other women filmmakers. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation with Shabnam. I am a filmmaker through this film. It's my first film, and essentially a practicing designer before that, based in Bangalore for the last 20 years. But most of my life has been in Delhi. And this film is a very personal journey. And I think it was a personal journey trying to connect up with a larger history, to see oneself as a continuum. And I'm really looking forward to discussing this. Also, because I realize now I have worked in different areas. I've worked as a designer, I have worked in museums, and I love storytelling and content interpreting. But I do find, and for many, many years, I've been a teacher. And in many ways, that is what I love doing the most. And I found a common link in a lot of my work is that I do like to look at the past and like to have a conversation with the past so that it can guide us into the future. It's an ongoing journey. And I'm looking forward to talking to you about your film, Shabnam, because I felt so moved, as I told you, that just those words of yours when you said that, Papa, it's taken me 30 years to have this conversation with you, I started crying. And I think it's the vulnerability of the way you've told the story. And you have had the courage to point the light at aspects of vulnerability in your father too, which is very, very touching and a very deeply moving experience. So I wanted to ask you, what made you finally decide to do this film?
Yeah, this is a question I keep asking myself even today. But I think it was more to make peace with my past, with my childhood, in a sense. And the idea to make the film came about only once I migrated to Canada. It's like that distance. And then when I started making documentaries, because it was very hard to kind of reinvent the artistic identity which I had in India, making a lot of television work, and people knew me as a filmmaker. And maybe the next step would have been feature films. But after coming to Canada, I was kind of thrown into this realm where I knew nobody. And I just bought a consumer end camera and I started, documenting my reality around me and making, short documentaries. And the process was so immersive that I started thinking of my dad and his work, since he was making documentaries. But up until then, I never really thought about that at all. That was a chapter which I thought had ended, as I even say in the film. So I was invited for a poetry festival. And the common theme which two of us artists had was father. And this fellow artist, she had recently lost her dad. So she wanted to pay a tribute to her father. And I had lost my dad when I was 14. So I said, okay, so let me start, thinking about that. And up until then I hadn't watched much of his work, except for India 67, of course, that iconic film. So I revisited that film, and I wrote a poem. And when I looked at that poem, I saw a film in there, because it was like literally had a structure from anger, resentment, and that whole arc of love and acceptance. And I embarked on that journey of making the film. But still, I wasn't there at the point where I could say, okay, yes, I'm making the film, in the sense I hadn't really formally begun the process of interviewing people, which I really did want to reach out to his friends. It's only when I came to Bombay and went to Films Division and talked to Mr. Kundu, and he was very happy that I wanted to make a film about my father. So that's how the process began. And once it got commissioned, I said, okay, now I actually have to make this film. I have a year to do it. And so let's put all the artifacts together. Let's line up the interviews. Still, it was like a detached process. The process of making the film itself was a detached process. However, I think the poem, what it gave me was a framework, within which to make the film.
And I think, in my case, it's like I hadn't intended to make a film when I set out because I wasn't a filmmaker then. I thought I would write an article about it. And, but when the conversation began with my father, I just felt it in my gut that this is a very, very important and precious story, and a film should be made about it. So I started reaching out to people to say that, look, can we get a crew? How do we put it together? And very quickly, I realized that it's quite complex and actually very difficult in the documentary film world. I mean, there is such little funds and so many people very capable to do it that fortunately I realized, let me not try this. And I just literally put a camera on a tripod and I said, let me start doing the research work and recording some of the footage so that whoever comes on board later has this material done. So I started doing it in almost a very playful way. And my father used to start laughing when he would see me with the camera because I wasn't one to hold one. And he would, at that point, he couldn't speak. He had lost his speech because of the stroke. So with his hands, he would gesture who's going to pay for this. And I would just sort of say, okay, the money will come along. So we just started doing it because it put him in a different space. It also, I think, made him feel very valued. And, this is a thing about the generation that has gone by, and they've had such incredible lives and such complex circumstances through which they came forth and, won some battles, lost some battles and they are quite used to no one actually wanting to know about that anymore, very unfortunately. So there was a sense of who's going to watch this film, even if you record it. Even Keshav said that to me. He said right away, who's backing you? And I was like, no one. But, it's a story that needs to be kept, even if it's for within the family. So I was aware of the fact that, look, eventually it just may become a home film, but it's a valuable thing for the grandkids to have. So it's a story, and I think the reason I was so keen to make the film was that I had understood that it was capturing a moment in the transition of our nation's history. That hockey team and these lives. And the fact that I am aware of the fact that partition is such a difficult topic and has so much trauma that even as a nation, we did not even acknowledge it for 50 years. So, it was a chance of going to that again. And they were willing to talk about it. I mean, I think your family has also experienced the partition, so you may be familiar with the silence that there is.
Yes.
And I have experiences from childhood where there would be unexplained outbursts of something more than anger. I mean, anguish, anger, a sense of betrayal. I mean, just so many emotions rolled up in one, and they would come spilling out. And one wouldn't know where that came from. And then it would be quickly covered over. And even as a child, I knew that you don't go there. You can't ask these questions. And at the same time, the village had gathered in our house, so to say, metaphorically, because, my father was one of the first to settle down. So I grew up hearing these stories about the homeland. And it would be like the land of milk and honey. And then when they would come to the partition, they would quickly gloss over and they would come to India and start talking of how they rebuilt their lives. So there was this gap. And at this point in their lives, both Keshav and my father actually wanted to go there. So, it's like they were wanting to speak about the question I wasn't asking anymore.
This is so amazing to listen to what you said, it's like you don't speak about things which torment you in a sense. And I can relate to that because after my father passed away, my mother and I never really talked about him for a very, very long time. Also because it was a very traumatic part of our lives, my father wasn't much of a homemaker. He was just immersed in his work. And we used to just always, we didn't know what to expect the next day, like it was, every day was a new day for us. So
Right.
after he went away, we never really discussed Sukhdev, and when I started talking to mom about him, I had to actually convince her. I said, look, people are forgetting his work because so much time has passed and nobody has heard of Sukhdev, his work. And his work is very critical to the Indian documentary movement, of the 60s and 70s. He almost shaped or challenged the grammar of documentary in that time period. And it's important we make a film about him and his work. So she came on board, convinced that, okay, in that case, I'll come on board. But of course, she was very reluctant to talk about the personal aspects. Basically, I created the sequence because mom wasn't willing to talk on camera, about dad, about how it was when I was growing up with him. So I said, okay, mom, let's look at old photographs. Again, reminiscent of your film, that whole sequence of seeing photographs. So we were seeing these old pictures. And at some point, she forgot the camera was rolling. And thank God it's digital because you could just roll all day,
Yeah.
And she started talking about him and his temper and how it was. And all those facts came out very casually while we were looking at photographs. And that's the only way I could get that information from my mother, because it had to be from her. She was the closest person who was with him until he passed. And she had seen him from the days of prior to him being a filmmaker, up until his early demise. So it was important that her story get documented because everybody else would talk about him as a filmmaker, but it was only my mother who could tell the story from behind the scenes. And then to see parallels of what was happening in the personal life at the different junctures of his films became very interesting for me in post-production, and with my editor, Jabin, we kind of constructed the story. But to me, I had to answer that question, that why am I really making this film? And that's a question that I was forced to answer by my colleague, Pankaj Rishi Kumar, who was a mentor on this film. He says, but why are you really making this film? I said, to bring his work alive, to get it to the younger generation of filmmakers. I think it's important they know that how a filmmaker like him worked with the movie camera, which was so heavy, and how he kept capturing the images that he did. He says, yeah, I understand all that, but why are you really making this film? After being poked and prodded after so much of that, I got so angry and I said, because I want to have a conversation with him, damn it. So he says, then do that. And that kind of planted the seed of having conversations with my father. And my experience with fiction film kind of helped me give that framework to the film, where I have these in-depth conversations with my dad. And I framed the film within that fictional construct, but very authentic because it was drawn from his interviews that I had read and the conversations I had had with his friends and colleagues. So that kind of gave me the framework. So I jumped from my mother and I've come to telling people.
No, but I wanted to share with you that I think what really moved me in some of the bits is that when you share what is behind the shot, when you share that you had just been slapped in order to get that, it's the truth, it's the truth, and that really moves you. It's like you allowed one into the back end, so to say. And I think in my film, what happened in the making of it is, and by the time it was over, I actually took the footage to Sushma, who was helping me edit. I mean, I didn't know whether it could be a film, but it's, you're very vulnerable with all the material you have. And I went to her and I said, "You didn't know my father. You don't know me very well right now. You just see the footage and tell me whether it can make a film." And is my father coming across as very vulnerable? Because my father had trusted me. We were in his bedroom. We were like, it was so intimate, the shots. Uh, and it's just these two things that I wanted an answer to. And she very quickly came back to me and said, "The footage is good. We can use it. And your father doesn't come across in any way compromised. He comes across as a very strong person, and he comes across as a person in charge. So you don't have to worry about that." After that, I said, okay, I know it's going to be a hard climb, because it is amateur footage in a large part, because it was shot by me, and only in bits I had taken a crew with me to Calcutta. But the very important shooting in Pakistan had been done entirely by me, because though I had tried to get two crews, for one reason or the other, they didn't show up. So the treatment of the film for me was, I want the spectators to know everything. What's happening in front, what's happening in behind, the chaos, the unpacking, and the edit, which was going to make the film come together. And I cannot thank Obro enough for going. He was the third editor in a sense that I worked with, and I would come to him and say, "I don't know if this film is ever going to get done, but I keep working with the footage along it, and this is the story I'm trying to tell." And I want it to be like a watercolor, not an oil painting. It's got to look like rushes. And you've got to feel like you're watching this film in the process of being made. And, it's made. So, to come back to this conversation with your father, there is something that is related in my journey to that, in the sense that my father was alive, but when we started making this film, he'd lost his speech. And uh, fortunately, we were very close. He had shared a lot with me. But in order to have these conversations, I used to have to articulate on his behalf. And very often he would say yes or no. And then, he would scribble a few words, and I would have to play this, game that we used to play of, people, places, whatever events, those 20 questions, perennial 20 questions. Is it this? Is it this? Is it this? And then when we got the context, I would start trying to articulate what he's trying to say, and he would try to help me. So, in this process, he actually had to allow me to enter his mind. But now he was vulnerable. And it's like a lot of people still expected him to be the hero. They would come visit him when he was totally broken in spirit. It was his worst nightmare that his, body, he couldn't use anymore. He couldn't speak. And they would say, "You can do it. You show the world that you're going to recover everything." And I remember at one point when everybody left, I just looked at him and I said, "You don't have to do anything. You don't have to do anything. And if you want to break down, you break down." And I mean, and that's what he wanted. He just wanted to put it all down. It's so, in that sense, I feel both my father and Keshav, and later Shahrukh, I met them at a point when they were willing to really just be who they were.
Yes.
Because it's at a point where I used to, call it Godhuli. I almost called the film Godhuli, because it's that beautiful sunset moment, which is also the favorite time of the day for me. And they were just willing to talk about everything. So, in some ways, the film does make, I feel, some sports people uncomfortable, because even though it's about the Olympic gold, and it doesn't get better than that, the champions are very fragile, and the film is about loss
And gain, in a way.
Yeah.
right? It's
Yes, yes,
also reclaiming yourself for who you are and being okay with it. It's
yeah,
uh, it's quite an amazing way that you put it, Bani, because it really even takes to the reasons why I made the film. It's like you also feel as a filmmaker or as an artist that you have nothing to lose, really.
Mhm.
It's
Mm.
only something you'll gain out of this process. So how it provides closure to the feelings, the suppressed feelings or experiences which you
Yes.
push back, and then you're ready to confront it at a certain time in your life. So I think you and I as women, I think, have shown a lot of courage
Mm.
in doing this, and in retrospect I can say that when I
Yes.
was doing it, it was just me going through a process of negotiation and acceptance and all of that. But once I finished with the film, it really left me feeling much better, in myself. Just the fact that I had done it. It really didn't matter to me at that point whether it will um, touch people emotionally. I said, okay, I've done my bit. And sure enough, after I made the film, finally my father was there on online searches, and that made me feel very accomplished. That I've done my bit, that his
Yes.
work has been revived, and people are talking about him, asking about him. There were young filmmakers, wanting to talk to me because he was part of their dissertations. It felt very good. It really felt
And
very good.
and did you? I mean, I felt when I saw your film that there was a shift in your perspective on your father. I mean, I felt it was then. Has it changed your relationship with your father in
Oh,
your?
absolutely. Not only my father, with other men in my life, be it my husband, my son, my other male colleagues, it definitely did have an impact. It's like you empower yourself when you make that kind of peace in these relationships. How do you relate to that?
So it's like they were always the heroes. They were all up there. But fortunately, within our relationship, there was a certain amount of equality, and which you'd be familiar with in India and in sometimes it's a very patriarchal sort of situation. So a
Not
daughter,
sometimes, Bunny.
okay, so a daughter disagreeing publicly and telling her father he's wrong when she's all of 11 or 12 was a no-no. And to give my father credit, which I appreciate now, at that point I took it for granted. He guarded that space, that my daughter and my wife can agree with me in public. And so it was disapproved of. And, as a child, you catch on to that disapproval. But, uh, I mean, somehow this journey of doing the film, uh, for me, it was, I mean, it is in some ways my medal. It's like my father did his journey. And I remember so many times I used to joke with him and I used to say, I don't want you to bequeath me your medal, your very precious gold medal. I want you to bequeath me the feeling that you had when you won that medal. And I did feel that, when the film was done and when the film was recognized, I kind of had that conversation with my father that, okay, thank you. I know what you felt like, some things are recognized, some things are not, but I think all of us have that experience in our lives when we do cross a certain point and we accomplish something and we know that this happened only because I could do it and I did it. And I think that was what that gold medal must have felt like for that team, because they were such underdogs in many ways. They're
Yes.
going from a country which is completely broken. My father was a refugee at that point, so was Keshav Dutt. And look at the poetry of it. We come across England in the final, and there were players who told me that this flag that we had grown up with a desire to possess, and we could be jailed for having it, was flying in Wembley Stadium, and the Queen stood up for it. And my father told me that the whole team was crying. So this thing of kind of really kind of saying the treasure we have, and the treasure that we have to redefine for ourselves, and also to kind of go back, because there's so much wounding when you have to leave a homeland, and that wounding continues to us, because there is a part, we are a continuum with them, and there's been a break over there. And if we can't go back there collectively, and I say this for people across the border as well, because the name Taangh actually came up in Lahore, because when I would go to Lahore and I would meet people and they would find out why I was there, they would say to me, Sanu vi badi Taangh hai, that we also have this longing to go to the land of our ancestors.
Yes.
And this border and this war and everything just became so pointless. So it's a bit like, if we cannot go back collectively to that point and heal it over there, we're going to be we're going to be taking decisions perhaps not from a position of being informed correctly. So for me, it was very, very precious that, pursuing the story, I was able to go to Lahore and I was able to unpack my own history myself. And
Yes.
that was very valuable. That was very valuable. And I felt that in your film also, that, you are unpacking your own personal history, which is connecting up with a nation's history. And, one could even go further and say, okay, why was such a sensitive person as Sukhdev wounded in some ways? And it's coming out in these different things. And if we continue to pursue that, one could come to a point where it's common for many people, the hurt.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I think it's also about putting a stop to the intergenerational trauma. I think that is also key, especially when you talk about even crossing borders, because you may run away from your reality. Like, even like for me, it was also leaving behind whatever I had made for myself in India, but I was thinking of my kids and I was thinking about raising them. But after coming here, when you decide to go through those dark places, what you're doing is you're putting an end to that trauma which you've experienced, in a sense, because you don't want to pass it on to your kids. When you become a parent, and you can speak to that, what that does to you, how as a parent or as a mother, you are so protective, and you don't want, that aspect of yourself to go to your kids. So I think for me, it was also that, I wanted my children to grow up in a very secure environment, and not a forced security, but a real happy, where you could just blossom and be yourself. So for me, that was also the reason, I think, now that I look back and I think about even the other works that I've done, that has been my purpose. And I think that is our purpose in life, right? We need to make peace with all those demons or those things which were uncomfortable in our growing years, and we need to negotiate with that. And actually, I want to come back to the beautiful characterizations that you've created in your film. And before I forget, I want to ask you that. Why did you ever try to connect Shah Rukh with your father, or with Keshav? Because with Keshav we shared a very special bond. Did you get them to talk to?
So I wanted to. I mean, it's actually very interesting that you asked this question. I wanted to, and it was the first thing that I tried to do, actually. And all three of them didn't want to meet each other on Zoom also, or Skype. They just wanted to walk away from that.
Wow.
I mean, Keshav and my father, of course, had stayed in touch, but Shah Rukh and my father, and they didn't want. And look, I mean, it was very clear. It was like, let us have our memories.
Yeah.
And we'll meet through you, but they didn't want to even discuss it. So there again, that silence came. Yeah.
Wow, but I'm glad you didn't harp on that aspect, because that's
really
showing that how we still are wounded.
Yes.
In a way, right?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah. Another question. I know we're running out of time, but I wanted to ask: did your father get to see the film?
So he saw quite a bit of the rushes. I shared a lot of Lahore with him, and he used to sit, riveted to it. And actually, that's what gave me the idea of, filming him looking at it. So there were some bits that I kept away from him, like the fact that I was able to find his home was a surprise. I
Yeah.
wasn't, that's why there was a gut sense. An uncle of mine had roughly described where their house used to be. So I had gone to that house, and actually on that day I had been pursued by security. So it was a little bit dangerous. So I had just quickly filmed what I thought was the house. And look at the gut instinct when you talk of intergenerational trauma. The one that I felt was the house. And I
Wow.
had filmed it the longest. And then
Wow.
that I had edited that bit, and then I sit with my father and I showed to him, and you can see his sense of urgency that he just wants to get there, and
Yes.
he wants to, and he's that relief on his face. I mean, his look said a million words because he couldn't speak about it, and he didn't want to go there. Even when I tried to ask him later, it was like, okay, you don't enter there now. So the
Yeah, I
wound
mean,
is there. Yeah.
your interview with him was so poignant because, as you say, there were no words, but there was so much said. And I think that's the beauty of your relationship with your father at that point in life. And
Yeah.
I must say I do miss looking at pictures of you and your dad, but I know why you didn't use them, because you wanted to focus on the big picture, photographs
Yeah.
of his friends, his colleagues, the players. So that was your focus in the film.
Yes.
Yeah, but I'm always hungry to see more personal family archive.
I would say, I wanted to ask you, your decision to put yourself in front of the camera. I mean, I can share mine. Mine was because I was very keen for the present to engage with the past. In continuation with my, I've realized, work journey for a while, and the daughter is a very crucial element to make that voice contemporary. So I very deliberately was putting myself in front of the camera for that reason, that it has to become about today. And the past is always changing. Actually, look at the way, your past perhaps with your father has changed in some ways, because there's a different understanding that you bring to that. And
Absolutely, absolutely,
similarly,
absolutely.
the past can be changed.
Yeah, yeah. So I think for me it was a very a practical decision to be in front of the camera, also because I was trying to adopt the use of a formal aesthetic of autoethnography. So in trying to position myself in front of the camera was that conscious decision of doing that. And then I thought, how can I show my relationship with my mother if I'm not in the same frame? So yeah, also like you're filming a vulnerable subject, but if you yourself are not in that position of vulnerability, you don't have a right to do that. So I felt I need to also expose myself, that exposing yourself in that position. So the ethical duality is always there, right? Your ethical concern that I hope I'm not crossing those
Yeah.
boundaries.
Yeah.
So when my mother did see the film, when I showed it to her, she says, there's so much I didn't know about Sukhdev, which you brought to light.
That's
She was
beautiful.
just looking at him from the perspective of a wife, as a woman who's a homemaker, and just not knowing what's going on in his professional
Yeah.
world, in his life and his conflicts. She never was privy to that. And then
Yeah.
she turned around and told me, she says, you're too clever. You made me say all those things. I said, but no, you shared them with me. I mean, it's not like I prodded, I didn't have questioned
Yeah.
you, but
Yeah.
it just became so organic with her. But
Yeah.
she said, I'm glad you did it. And
Yeah.
she was really
So,
proud that
yeah.
I could make this film about
Yeah.
him. And how
Yeah.
everybody went to her and they were like so happy to meet her. Like she was like the star of the show,
That's
So for
wonderful.
mom, she wanted to be an
Yeah.
actress, right? When she was young. So for
Yeah.
her, it was
Right.
a moment of glory that,
Wow.
theek hai,
So, Shabnam, I think you and I have a lot to talk about.
I know we have
And
to continue this
yes,
conversation, right?
yes, we have to
Yeah.
continue this conversation. But thank you so much for Vichitra Collective to bring us together. I can't thank
Honestly,
you
really,
enough.
thank you, Vichitra. We really, really, really appreciate Farah. Thank you so much. It's
Yes.
really been a delight to be on this forum. And I really hope to see more interviews, with other filmmakers and listen to their stories, their journeys, things which you don't ordinarily get to listen to. So Bichitra has really provided that platform. So thank you.